It begins, as these stories often do, with whispers. A name half-spoken in the parlors of Beacon Hill. A glance exchanged across the aisles of King's Chapel. A sudden silence when footsteps approach. The widow Calderon, they said, had ambitions for her daughters not measured in husbands or dowries. Her mansion still stands in fragments in the records. A brick facade on Mount Vernon Street, gas lamps flanking the iron gate. Its drawing rooms hung with imported tapestries. Behind the heavy curtains, the Calderon household concealed practices that, even in the mid-19th century, shocked those who came too close to the truth. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. Elias Calderon, the patriarch, had built his fortune in shipping routes to Havana, Santo Domingo and Liverpool. Cargoes of molasses and tobacco and less legal commodities whispered about but never proven. When Elias died suddenly in 1846, his widow Marguerite Calderon inherited both the house and the fortune. Contemporary observers noted that she stepped into her husband's place, with startling confidence, presiding over family business matters, receiving bankers in her own parlor, and cultivating an air of imperious self-possession. She had 3 surviving daughters: Clara, the eldest at 24 in 1852, bookish and pale; Eliza, 21, restless, known for sudden fits of temper; and Nora, still only 18, described by one visitor as a girl of uncommon brightness, yet curiously subdued in her manner, as though chastened by some secret sorrow. It was said in tones of both admiration and dread that Marguerite did not intend her daughters to marry at all. Boston society offered explanations: eccentric mourning, religious devotion, distaste for suitors. Yet within the Calderon mansion another explanation was whispered, that the widow sought to build not alliances but a lineage. The first clear indication appears in the journals of Dr. Jonathan Clara, a physician, whose practice served several prominent Beacon Hill family. His 1852 notebook, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, records a curious visit from Marguerite. She arrived unannounced, requesting absolute discretion. She inquired, he wrote, whether a lady of delicate constitution might be provided the means of conception, without the entanglement of marital obligation. Clara, unsettled, attempted to redirect her inquiries, but she pressed him. Money, she said, would be no object. Though Clara claims to have declined, a note in his ledger for August 1852 reads only, "Consultation, Calderon, Fee 56. What was discussed that day became the seed of a conspiracy extending far beyond the physician's chamber. The mechanism of the widow's scheme surfaced years later in fragments of testimony: quiet payments made to young clerks, apprentices, sailors on leave, always men without family connections, men who could be dismissed or disbelieved. They were summoned discreetly to the Calderon mansion, admitted by a servant, and led to the upper floors where the daughters resided. Some later claimed to have believed they were to be companions, tutors, or hired escorts. Others admitted they understood their purpose clearly enough. What is most disturbing in the accounts is not only the widow's orchestration, but the way she spoke of her daughters. To one sailor she allegedly remarked, "My Clara has excellent lungs. Listen when she reads aloud. My Nora, you will see, possesses symmetry beyond her years. Such qualities must not be squandered." Marguerite Calderon, it seems, regarded her children as breeding stock, instruments through which she might refine what she called the Calderon inheritance. Why she pursued this course remains contested. Some argue that she had absorbed pseudo-scientific theories from continental texts circulating in Boston at the time, treatises on hereditary genius, phrenology, and controlled breeding. Others suggest her motives were more personal: Elias Calderon's rumored infidelities, her desire to create a line that bore no trace of outside contamination. Whatever her reasoning, the practice took hold in that year, and by late 1852 at least 2 of her daughters showed the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. In the letters of Reverend Amos Lothrop, pastor of a nearby Unitarian church, one finds veiled allusions to the Calderon household. He wrote to a colleague, "There is among my flock a lady of high estate whose household conduct has become the subject of scandal. I am urged to speak with her daughters, yet I fear that in entering that house, I should place myself in peril, for the mother is of formidable intelligence and brooks no interference." That peril was not imagined. Servants who attempted to leave the Calderon house were pursued with threats of legal action, or bribed into silence. 2 maids, according to later affidavits, vanished altogether, after declaring their intent to seek other positions. Their names appear on no subsequent census roll. The surviving fragments of household accounts from 1852 provide further evidence. Among ordinary expenses for coal, lace and port wine are peculiar notations. Payment, Mr. Rowe, 15. Payment, Mr. Gage. The recipients were young men, none over 25, and their occupations suggest transience. Their connection to the Calderon household is otherwise unexplained. By autumn of that year, rumors had spread too widely to be contained. Neighbors spoke of unusual deliveries at the mansion, crates of medical instruments, jars of spirits, quantities of linen. One coachman reported conveying a barrel marked specimens from a chemist's shop to the Calderon house, though what it contained is unknown. Marguerite, far from retreating under suspicion, hosted gatherings at which she displayed her daughters as though presenting the progress of some horticultural experiment. Guests noted the daughters' strained expressions, the widow's commanding presence at their side, and the curious absence of eligible young men from these gatherings. One guest, the merchant's wife Abigail Cushing, later recalled, Mrs. Calderon spoke of her children in the most unnatural terms. She said, "I intend that my line shall improve upon the fathers who planted it. In this house we shall breed not as beasts do, by chance but by design." The words chilled me so that I could scarcely reply. It was during this period that Dr. Samuel Hughes, a young physician then newly established in Boston, first heard of the Calderon case. A sailor he had treated for a venereal complaint confided that he had once been summoned to the Calderon mansion, paid to do a service no honest man would boast of. Hughes at first dismissed the tale as drunken invention, but when similar accounts emerged from unrelated sources, he began to suspect something far darker. In his diary of November 1852, Hughes wrote, "There is in Beacon Hill a household where the ordinary bonds of nature are inverted, and where science is invoked to sanctify what conscience abhors. I fear that if these reports prove true, they disclose not only private corruption, but a danger to the very principles by which our society orders itself." It would not be until months later that Hughes, with the reluctant assistance of lawyer Thomas Fletcher, would enter the Calderon house under the pretext of attending to Eliza's difficult confinement. What he recorded there would alter the course of his life, and as later historians argue, expose the foundation of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the Calderon family alone. But that is to anticipate. In 1852 the mansion still stood intact, its shutters closed against the street, the widow Calderon presiding within. To outward appearances, she was merely an eccentric matron, guarding her daughters from unsuitable suitors. Behind those brick walls, however, lay the first stirrings of a program of human design that Boston society would not acknowledge until scandal forced it into daylight. The whispers were only beginning. By the spring of 1853, the Calderon mansion had grown quieter to outside eyes, yet inside its halls the widow's designs advanced. What began as whispered suspicion now pressed against the walls of propriety, threatening to burst into scandal. One detail anchors our understanding: the births themselves. Records from Dr. Jonathan Clymer's private notes, those same pages later entered into evidence during legal proceedings, describe 2 confinements in rapid succession, both managed within the Calderon home. No public announcements were made, no christenings, no parish registers. Only in Clymer's coded jottings do we find mention. Clara, delivered March 1853. Eliza, delivered June 1853. He adds in a marginal note, "Mother presided. Insists infants be regarded as her own legacy, not as bastards." What became of those children has been debated for more than a century. Some accounts suggest they were kept within the mansion, raised in seclusion by wet nurses employed at extravagant wages. Others argue that the infants were removed shortly after birth, sent to anonymous foster families or placed in private institutions, where oversight could be discreetly purchased. The absence of baptismal records supports either possibility. Meanwhile, the daughters themselves were seen less often. Clara, once occasionally glimpsed in the public garden with a book under her arm, retreated almost entirely from public life. Eliza's temper grew more pronounced. A seamstress recalled her outburst when fitted for a gown. "She struck the fabric from my hands and cried that she would not be dressed like a broodmare." Nora, youngest and still not publicly disgraced, appeared subdued, her expression noted as vacant, almost spectral. Servants spoke in lowered tones of arguments carried through the corridors. One claimed to have heard Clara beg her mother, "Please let us live as women, not as subjects of some trial," to which the widow replied coldly, "You are women precisely because you are subjects. Do not squander what Providence has placed in your vein." The wider neighborhood, accustomed to eccentricity among Boston's elite, began to take more notice. Deliveries of chemical supplies became too frequent to ignore. Carboys of spirits, quantities of chalk and quicklime, surgical instruments ordered from London. Neighbors whispered that a private laboratory existed in the Calderon cellar. Indeed, in later years when the house was investigated, Shelves were found there stocked with jars of preserved specimens, fetuses, according to horrified witnesses, though the jars had been smashed in the confusion of discovery and their contents never officially catalogued. Among the most chilling testimonies comes from a young maid named Ellen, who fled the house in late 1853 and sought work in Charlestown. Interviewed years later, she described assisting Marguerite during one of the confinements. She claimed the widow had kept detailed ledgers in which each infant was recorded not by name, but by notation. Subject A, male, weight 7 lo, 4 oz, cranial circumference satisfactory, disposition, retained. Another entry subject B, female, weight 6 lo, 9 oz, lungs weak, disposition removed. Ellen swore she saw the ledger herself, though she could not say what removed precisely meant. Outside society tried to look away, wealth commanded silence, and the Calderon fortune purchased much of it. Judges, magistrates, and even clergymen received generous donations. The widow entertained influential men in her parlor, serving Madeira, while her daughters lingered like pale shadows behind her. Boston's elite, fearful of scandal, colluded in their own blindness. Not everyone remained silent. Among the few voices to speak was Sophia Alcott, a young seamstress, whose infant daughter had been taken in 1852 under circumstances that later connected to the Calderon case. In a sworn statement, she described how a woman in a dark veil approached her after church, offering a position of employment in the Calderon household if she surrendered her child. Desperate and impoverished, Sophia agreed. She never saw her daughter again. When Sophia later attempted to inquire, she was dismissed and threatened. Her testimony, ignored at first, would later prove essential. It suggested that not all the infants born under the Calderon roof were products of the daughters alone, that outside children, obtained through coercion, may have been incorporated into the widow's experiment. The Calderon daughters themselves occupied a strange position, both victims and participants. Catherine Lawrence, in your earlier samples, became the mouthpiece of conscience. In this version, it was Nora Calderon who attempted to resist. Notes in He's diary describe a clandestine meeting with her in November 1853, arranged by a sympathetic servant. Nora, he writes, appeared as one who has been starved of sunlight, her cheeks hollow, her eyes red from weeping. She confessed that she and her sisters were compelled by their mother to endure unions with men not of their choosing, all under the guise of some higher calling. He recounts that Nora pressed a small vial into his hands, insisting it contained a preparation her mother used upon the infants. She whispered, he writes that I must learn what it is, for she feared it brought sleep from which the babes never woke. The physician, torn between professional duty and fear of reprisal, concealed the vial in his practice. Later analysis suggested it contained tincture of laudanum, mixed with belladonna, enough to render an infant insensible, possibly to death. By 1854, whispers hardened into rumors that reached beyond Boston. A Hartford newspaper hinted at unnatural practices in a house of quality. Philadelphia reformers, already engaged in exposing corruption in almshouses, exchanged letters mentioning a matron of Boston, whose zeal for hereditary purity surpasses nature's laws. Inside the mansion, Marguerite's power only tight. Clara, described as frail, suffered another confinement in early 1854. Eliza, consumed by rage, allegedly struck her mother during an argument. A servant recalled the sound of a slap followed by silence, and Eliza's face mottled with bruises the next day. Nora, youngest, became the household's last fragile conscience, clinging to scraps of normalcy, begging Dr. Hughes for help. The conspiracy widened when evidence emerged that the widow was not acting alone. Among Clymer's papers appeared correspondence signed only, later attributed to Judge Alpheus Archer, a prominent jurist. The letters congratulated Marguerite on her progress and urged her to continue despite opposition. Payments noted in her ledger correspond to accounts in Archer's name. Similarly implicated was coroner Elias Danforth, who in official records repeatedly signed off on infant deaths as natural weakness or failure to thrive, shielding the Calderons from scrutiny. His handwriting appears beside notations in the widow's ledger. Disposition confirmed. Thus the Calderon project cannot be understood as the madness of one widow alone, but as the intersection of wealth, influence, and a growing movement in mid-century America, what contemporaries called improvement, and what later generations would name with more sinister accuracy, eugen. The climax of this phase came in July 1854, when fire gutted a wing of the Calderon mansion. Officially, it was explained as a kitchen accident, but among the debris investigators found fragments of glass jars, scorched anatomical drawings, and bones too small to belong to adults. The discovery was hastily contained, reports suppressed, yet word leaked that the widow's house concealed horrors, unsuited to public description.
Dr. Hughes, writing in despair to his friend Fletcher, declared, "The rot runs deeper than one household. What I have glimpsed is the shadow of a philosophy that, if permitted to grow, will strangle the very heart of our republic." By late summer, the Calderon daughters had vanished from public view altogether. Some said they had fled abroad. Others believed they remained captives in their mother's house, hidden from the curious. The truth, as later investigations revealed, was far stranger and far darker. Thus, by the close of 1854, Boston society stood at the threshold of revelation. What had been rumor was on the verge of exposure. The Calderon conspiracy, part family tragedy, part political scandal, part medical horror, would soon erupt into trials, resignations, and whispered denials that shaped the city's conscience for decades. But before those revelations came, the final transformation within the Calderon household had already begun.
By 1855, the Calderon household was no longer whispered about merely in parlors and church aisles. It had become a subject of fear, a dark fascination, a scandal so grotesque that most denied it outright. Yet the records of that year, court petitions, medical notes, servant testimony show how deeply Marguerite Calderon's project had taken root. The fire of 1854 had destroyed much, but not the widow's resolve. Within months, she had rebuilt the damaged wing, replacing the charred timbers with sturdier stone. Contemporary neighbors remarked that the reconstruction was completed with unusual haste, even working by lamplight late into the night. When questioned, Marguerite replied coolly that the work of Providence admits no delay. What the new wing contained, however, was no ordinary household chamber. Surviving blueprints show sealed rooms, narrow corridors and windows bricked over from the inside. Later testimony from masons hired under contract indicates that they were instructed never to enter certain sections, only to pass their materials through locked doors where servants carried them further. It was within these newly built chambers that the next stage of the widow's design unfolded. Clara Calderon, weakened by repeated confinements, was said to have grown spectral. A surviving letter from her to a cousin in Salem, intercepted and hidden away until decades later, pleads, "We are not permitted to leave. Our mother calls us vessels. I beg you, if this reaches you, to speak to no one lest she punish me further. I dream sometimes of the river, and of throwing myself into its cold water, but even that liberty is denied me. Pray for us." The letter was never sent. It was discovered hidden within the lining of a servant's trunk after the servant's death. Eliza, always the fiercest, resisted more openly. Rumors circulated of violent scenes. Eliza striking at her mother with scissors. Eliza attempting to set fire to her bedding. Eliza being confined to one of the new bricked rooms for days at a time. A coachman later testified he once glimpsed her from the carriage house window, pacing behind iron bars as though in a private gaol. Nora, the youngest, withdrew further into silence, yet it was she who became the conduit through which outside observers pieced together what was happening inside. In Dr. Hughes's journals, the entries of 1855 grow increasingly frantic. He recounts secret notes smuggled from Nora. She writes that infants are measured, compared and weighed as livestock would be, that some are taken from their cradles and carried down into the cellar, never to return. She fears for her own mind, as dreams and waking blend together. She begs that I intercede. Yet what power have I, without ruin to myself? The measuring Nora described was corroborated by the eventual discovery of phrenological charts in the Calderon house. Popular in the mid-19th century, phrenology claimed to read intelligence and character from skull shapes. Among the widow's papers were sketches of her grandchildren's heads, with notes such as prominent occipital promising for endurance, or frontal region underdeveloped disappointing. It was not enough for Marguerite to secure pregnancies. She evaluated the offspring against her own evolving doctrine of improvement. Those who failed, the records suggest, were quietly disposed of. In April 1855, another crisis erupted. A body, an infant wrapped in linen, was discovered floating in the Charles River. Its chest bore puncture marks, as if from surgical instrument. Though officially declared an unclaimed foundling, a midwife who viewed the corpse remarked privately that it bore resemblance to the Calderon features. She was warned into silence, but word spread nonetheless. The newspapers did not name the Calderons directly, but one anonymous editorial thundered, "There are houses among us wherein the laws of God and nature are flouted, where wealth cloaks unspeakable practices. Shall Boston sleep while her very streets are stained with such infamy?" It was then that legal petitions began to gather momentum. Thomas Fletcher, the lawyer allied with Dr. Hughes, compiled affidavits from former servants. One described a ledger in which infants were listed only by number, with notes in the widow's hand, subject deny and dispose. Another recounted hearing Marguerite instruct her daughters to accept the chosen men without resistance, for the lineage must not falter. Yet every attempt to bring the case forward met obstruction. Judge Archer, implicated in correspondence, dismissed Fletcher's petitions for want of credible evidence. Coroner Danforth, still in office, falsified death certificates. Even Reverend Lothrop, who had once hinted at concern, now declared publicly that Miss Calderon is a woman of unimpeachable character. Though eccentric in grief, the machinery of wealth protected her. But dissent grew within the household itself. Clara's health failed. Her confinement in late 1855 nearly killed her. Servants whispered that she was left on her bed for 3 days, bleeding and delirious, while her mother stood beside her and dictated notes to a secretary about the child's cranial development. The child itself, its fate unrecorded, vanished soon after. Eliza's resistance culminated in an incident that winter. She fled the house one night, barefoot and half-dressed, pounding on the door of a neighbor on Mount Vernon Street. The neighbor, horrified, admitted her briefly, but within an hour Calderon's servants arrived with a physician and removed her by force. The neighbor later claimed Eliza screamed, "They will bury me in the cellar," before being silenced. Her fate afterward is unclear. Some sources suggest she was confined permanently to the bricked rooms. Others believe she was quietly sent to an asylum under her mother's orders. Her name entered under an alias. No definitive record survives. Nora, alone, remained in partial communication with Hugh. His diary of December 1855 records their last known meeting. She appeared gaunt, trembling, but still lucid. She begged him once more to intervene. "She told me," he wrote, "that her mother speaks now of founding a dynasty of perfected blood, and that she, Nora, fears soon it will be her turn again. She asked if I believed God would forgive her for wishing her mother dead. Hughes confessed he had no answer. He urged her to flee, but she shook her head. She will find me anywhere. I am bound by her name." The pressure of scandal finally forced small cracks in the facade. In early 1856, an anonymous pamphlet circulated in Boston under the title "The Breeding House of Beacon Hill." It detailed, in lurid but recognizable terms, the widow's practices. Though authorities dismissed it as sensational slander, the pamphlet spread rapidly, reaching New York and Philadelphia. The Calderon name became synonymous with whispered corruption. Marguerite responded by doubling her public piety. She donated lavishly to churches, funded an orphanage, and entertained clergymen in her home. To the outside world, she was a benevolent widow slandered by jealous rivals, yet within her walls, the ledger entries continue. The escalation reached its breaking point with the case of a young apprentice named Matthew Greer, summoned to the house in 1856 under the pretense of employment. He later confided to a friend that he had been commanded to lay with one of the daughters, under threat of ruin. Terrified, he fled and attempted to press charges. His testimony, however, was discredited. He was painted as a drunk and a thief. Within weeks he vanished from Boston entirely. His body, if ever found, was not recorded. Still, his story circulated among working men, adding fuel to the growing unrest. The Calderon scandal was no longer confined to parlors and medical journals. It was now a subject of tavern talk, a working-class legend of horror. By the end of 1856, the mansion on Mount Vernon Street had become a fortress. Servants were reduced in number, visitors restricted, shutters drawn even by day. The widow Calderon remained imperious, her fortune intact, her daughters broken shadows at her side. Yet the outside world was closing in. Fletcher and Hughes, undeterred, gathered new evidence. Disillusioned allies of the widow began to defect, and rumors suggested that one of the surviving children, the successful subjects, had begun to show deformities that could not be concealed. Thus the stage was set for the eruption that would follow: trials, exposures, and the unmasking of a philosophy too dreadful to be dismissed as eccentric grief. But within those shuttered rooms, as the year turned, the Calderon project was still alive, still expanding. The walls themselves seemed to whisper. By 1857, Boston's polite society could no longer ignore the rumors. The Calderon house, with its sealed wings and shuttered windows, had become an open wound on Beacon Hill. Some families crossed the street rather than pass its gate. Others sent curious glances at the covered carriages that arrived after nightfall, depositing men of good breeding and questionable morality at the widow's door. It was in this year that the veil of secrecy first began to lift, not because the widow relented, but because her circle of accomplices began to fracture. The Calderon ledgers. In January 1857, a servant named Alice Briggs was dismissed abruptly after 5 years of service. She was accused of theft, though no proof was offered. Fearing ruin, she sought out attorney Thomas Fletcher, already whispered to be collecting evidence against the family. From her belongings,
She produced 2 folded sheets she had stolen from the widow's stud. These were not ordinary household accounts. They listed dates, initials and notations beside each. Conception achieved, subject delivered, defective, removed, potential promising. Fletcher, horrified, copied the sheets into his private file. Briggs begged him never to reveal her name, for she feared Calderon reprisals. He promised to protect her, though within 6 months she was dead of consumption. Some speculated her illness was genuine, others whispered she had been silent. The confession of Nurse Adeline. Around the same time, a midwife named Adeline Maury approached Dr. Hughes in secrecy. She had been employed by the Calderons intermittently to attend deliveries. Her testimony, later written down by Hughes, remains one of the most chilling accounts in the archive. I was brought to the house at night, and told I must not speak of what I saw. The daughters were pale, trembling, and obedient to their mother's command. I delivered infants who were not allowed to be nursed at the breast, but taken instead to a separate chamber, where measurements were made before I was dismissed. Once, when I asked where a child had gone, the widow said coldly, "We do not keep the failure." Maury described jars in a locked cabinet, containing what she believed to be preserved stillbirths. She had never dared ask again. Clara's collapse. The eldest daughter, Clara, succumbed at last in May. After repeated confinements and years of decline, she died following what was officially described as a sudden fever, but Hughes's notes reveal he was summoned in desperation to the Calderon house, where he found Clara hemorrhaging after a failed delivery. He wrote that Marguerite Calderon insisted upon continuing examinations of the dead infant, even as Clara gasped for breath. Clara's body was interred quietly, without public funeral. Neighbors remarked that the widow wore no mourning clothes, but instead appeared grimly satisfied, as if Clara's death had confirmed some inevitable calculation. Some accounts suggest she was confined permanently in the cellar chambers. One former servant swore she heard sobbing and muffled screams beneath the floors for weeks, until silence fell at last. Others believed she was committed to the Westboro Asylum under an assumed name. No admission register conclusively confirms this, but a female patient admitted in 1857, recorded only as EC, 22 years, matches her description. The patient's notes describe violent refusals to eat, repeated cries of, "Do not breed me again," and eventual mutism. Whether she died in confinement or languished for decades, Eliza's fate remains among the most haunting enigmas of the case. Nora's plea. That summer, Nora Calderon sought out Hughes once more. His diary entry of July 3 preserves their final known conversation. "She came veiled, trembling, a mere specter of the girl I once knew. She spoke of her terror that she was next, that her mother intended her to replace Clara in the program. She begged me on her knees to end her life before her mother's men could take her. I could not comply. Instead, I urged her to flee. She whispered, 'There is no escape. She has eyes everywhere. Even the judges are hers.'" Hughes's final line. "I fear Nora will not live much longer, whether by her own hand or by the design of that monstrous woman." The public scandal breaks. By autumn, whispers had swelled into printed rumor. The Boston Evening Transcript published a veiled editorial, referring to a widow of high station, who abuses her daughters and perverts the sanctity of the home in service of wild and perverse theories. Though no name was printed, all Beacon Hill knew to whom it referred. Marguerite Calderon responded with defiance. She sued the paper for libel, denouncing its editor as an agent of the jealous and unlearned. The case drew public attention, and for the first time testimony began to spill into the open. Fletcher, emboldened, leaked portions of the ledger. Hughes spoke cautiously of unnatural practices he had observed, and Adeline Maury, the midwife, was subpoenaed, though before she could testify, she vanished on the road to court. Her carriage found overturned, her body never recovered. The Society for Human Advancement. It was during these proceedings that investigators stumbled upon a deeper network. Among the widow's correspondence were letters from prominent men, legislators, physicians, even clergy, praising her experiments and offering financial or moral support. They styled themselves the Society for Human Advancement. The widow was not merely pursuing a private obsession. She was participating in a clandestine circle of elites who believed human breeding could and should be directed toward a higher rate. This revelation ignited outrage, but also paralysis. How could the courts prosecute when their own judges were implicated? How could the press report freely when publishers themselves were listed among the supporters? Still, the evidence mounted. The fire in the West Wing. In December 1857, a fire broke out in the sealed wing of the Calderon mansion. Firemen arriving on the scene reported difficulty gaining entry. Doors were locked from within, windows brick. When finally broken through, they discovered charred remains of what appeared to be small cradles, scorched medical instruments, and blackened bone fragments too small for adult bodies. The official record declared the fire accidental, caused by a tipped oil lamp, but the whispers said otherwise, that the widow herself had set the blaze to destroy incriminating evidence, perhaps even living children. The stench, neighbors later recounted, clung to the house for weeks. Aftermath of 1857. By year's end, the Calderon name was irreparably tainted. Clara was dead, Eliza vanished, Nora fading into despair, servants deserted in droves, visitors dwindled, yet the widow herself remained unbowed, still receiving a few allies in her parlor, still writing letters that defended her work as righteous, scientific and ordained by Providence. Boston was left divided. Some believed her guilty of crimes too dreadful to name, others insisted she was the victim of hysteria and envy. The truth, obscured by corruption and fear, remained locked within those shuttered walls, but the stage was. The following years would see the scandal erupt in open trials, exposing not merely one widow's obsession, but a whole network of power and pseudoscience that reached into the highest offices of the city. The Calderon secret could no longer remain confined, and those who had witnessed it firsthand, the physicians, the servants, the children who survived, would carry its weight into the generations that followed.
The year 1858 dawned under the shadow of mounting revelations. What had begun as whispers on Beacon Hill was now a matter of depositions, affidavits and public outcry. Yet even as Boston reeled from rumors of the Calderon mansion's hidden atrocities, the widow herself pressed forward with cold determination. If the law crept closer, her answer was not to retreat, but to document her designs with a meticulousness that bordered on madness. What investigators recovered in this period were not just letters and ledgers, but full treatises, an entire philosophy of breeding, written in the widow's steady hand. The Calderon manuscripts. Among the most disturbing discoveries were the so-called Calderon manuscripts, seized years later during the raids of 1859. Written on fine rag paper in elegant script, they bear titles such as On the Perfectibility of Human Stock, Notes Toward a Higher Generation, and Practical Methods for Domestic Experimentation. Passages from these manuscripts still chill the reader. It is the duty of those endowed with fortune and intelligence to improve mankind, by pruning weakness and cultivating strength. The poor breed without thought. We, who know better, must direct nature where she falters. Another section detailing selection of sires, men of vigorous constitution, preferably with noble features and strong jaw, must be chosen. They need not be aware of the true purpose. Coin suffices to purchase their service. The daughters, though reluctant, must be reminded that their bodies belong to posterity, not themselves. These writings confirm what testimony had already suggested, that the widow's program was no mere indulgence of grief, but a deliberate and systematized pursuit of eugenic theory, decades before the word itself had entered public discourse. Hughes, still secretly documenting what he could, began in 1858 to collect what evidence survived from the Calderon confinements. He bribed a former servant to smuggle out scraps, charts of infant measurements, sketches of cranial development, and notes comparing one child against another. One surviving page, now held in archives, lists: decadot, male, weight 7 lbs, 4 Rs, cranial index satisfactory, occipital well-formed, eyes blue, hair dark, subject 14, female, weak constitution, lungs insufficient, discard, subject 15, male, stillborn, skull preserved for study. Beneath these entries, in the widow's unmistakable hand, failure is part of progress. The weak are to be culled, else they pollute the stream. These cold evaluations reveal the heart of her program: human life reduced to entries in a breeding chart, infants treated as livestock, daughters reduced to vessels. Society for Human Advancement, expansion. Meanwhile, the Society for Human Advancement, the clandestine circle of elites aligned with Calderon, was spreading its influence. Correspondence from 1858 shows meetings held not only in Boston, but in New York and Philadelphia. Members included physicians advocating for hereditary science, judges willing to suppress evidence, and publishers who printed favorable tracts defending selective union. One letter, written to Calderon by a state legislator, praised her courage. "You stand at the vanguard of human improvement. What you do in private shall one day be codified as public policy. Our nation will thank you, though now it may cower." Such letters underscore how dangerous the network had become, not the obsession of one widow, but an ideology creeping into the halls of power. The case of Nora Calderon, if 1858 brought forth records and manuscripts, it also brought the final tragedy of the surviving daughter. Nora, the youngest, was by then the last under her mother's full control. Clara was dead. Eliza vanished. Nora, fragile but lucid, was forced into repeated confinements. Servants recalled her gaunt figure, her eyes haunted, her speech drifting into prayers and fragments of scripture. In late 1858 she gave birth to twins, one stillborn, one surviving only a few weeks. The living child was recorded in the ledger as subject 50. Notes remark, Jolin deficient, will not breed true, disposed. After this loss, Nora was said to have attempted self-harm. She was restrained, then locked for weeks in one of the brick chambers. Hughes's diary for November 1858 records, I have not heard from her in many weeks. I fear the girl is gone, whether by death or madness I cannot say. God forgive me for not intervening more bold. By year's end, Nora too had disappeared from all record, whether she died in childbirth, was buried in the cellar fires, or confined in secret until her mother's death. History does not know. Her absence marks the extinguishing of the daughters. The fire of 1858. That winter, another fire broke out in the Calderon mansion, this time consuming much of the new wing. Firefighters described a grotesque scene, animal bones mingled with infant skeletons, jars cracked by the heat spilling their contents across the stone floor. The official report once again attributed the blaze to faulty oil lamps, but among the firemen, grim tales circulated of rows of tiny skulls arranged upon shelves, of dissecting instruments laid out like a surgeon's table, of books scorched but legible enough to speak of hereditary lines and purity of blood. The public never saw these details. Officials sealed the reports, but whispers spread, and those whispers sharpened public suspicion into outrage. Trials prepared. By early 1859, pressure could no longer be suppressed. Fletcher, armed with the ledgers, and Hughes carrying his journals, pressed their case to the state authorities. For the first time the society's shield of influence faltered. Some allies, fearful of exposure, turned against Calderon, providing incriminating letters in exchange for lenience. Subpoenas were drafted, arrest warrants prepared, plans were made to raid the Calderon estate, to seize manuscripts and correspondence, to bring the widow herself before the court. Yet she remained eerily calm. One account describes her at church that spring, dressed in black silk, head high, whispering to a companion, "They cannot touch me, I am above them, for I serve a higher law." The widow's last defense. As the walls closed in, Marguerite Calderon composed one final document, addressed to posterity. In it she wrote, "Fools will drag me before their courts. They will shriek at what they do not comprehend, but history will absolve me. I am the first to dare what all others shrink from. They call it perversion. I call it progress. When centuries hence mankind has perfected itself, they will look back and name me mother of the higher race." This testament was seized during the raid. Its defiance stands as the widow's last known written word. Atmosphere in Boston. The city bristled with unease. Beacon Hill, once the pinnacle of refinement, was haunted by the knowledge that in its heart had thrived a breeding program more monstrous than any Gothic fiction. Servants whispered of midnight carriages. Mothers crossed themselves when walking past the mansion gates. And yet among some elites there remained a quiet sympathy. Behind closed doors men discussed Calderon's ideas with fascination, insisting that she was persecuted not for her crimes, but for her daring vision. Boston stood divided, half aghast, half complicit, toward the confrontation. Thus the stage was set for the great exposure of 1859, 1854, when the Calderon case would erupt into trials that shook the city. The manuscripts, the ledgers, the testimony of servants and physicians, all pointed to a system of crime so thorough, so protected, that only extraordinary effort could drag it into light. But the widow's shadow still loomed large, and even as subpoenas were drafted, whispers claimed she was preparing her escape, that she had contacts in Europe, allies abroad, and ships waiting in the harbor. The breeding house of Beacon Hill might be about to fall, but its mistress, like a serpent, seemed poised to slip away into darkness, carrying her philosophy to fresh soil. And that possibility, that she might continue elsewhere what she had begun in Boston, was what most horrified those who sought justice. The experiment, it seemed, was not yet over. The spring of 1859 brought an air of anticipation and dread. Samuel Hughes, the weary physician, who had borne witness to so much, wrote in his journal, "The city itself feels like a patient on the verge of fever. The pulse quickens, the air is heavy, and all wait for the crisis to erupt." For months, whispers of trials to come had stirred taverns, pulpits, and drawing rooms alike. Yet beneath the surface, a darker current moved. A network of powerful men worked to ensure that if Marguerite Calderon fell, she would not fall alone. The raids of 1859. In April, state marshals,
accompanied by Fletcher and a reluctant Dr. Hughes, descended upon the Calderon estate. The mansion loomed silent, its windows shuttered, the iron gates locked. Servants had been dismissed days prior. Only the widow and a handful of loyal retainers remained within. When the marshals forced entry, they found not chaos but eerie order. The drawing rooms were spotless, the dining table set with polished silver. Portraits of the daughters, Clara, Eliza, Nora, hung above the hearth, their painted faces gazing out with lifeless serenity. It was in the cellars that the truth emerged. Behind bricked walls, investigators uncovered narrow rooms containing iron bedsteads, leather straps and stained linen. In adjoining chambers stood shelves of glass jars, each holding specimens, organs, limbs, infant skulls. Notes attached in the widow's hand gave measurements, weights and judgments. One jar bore the inscription, Subject, 15, skull promising, but heart malformed, discarded. Another, Subject, 15 female, lungs weak, burned to prevent contamination. The cellar stank of lye and smoke. Hughes, though hardened by years of medical practice, collapsed to his knees. The laboratory notebooks. Beyond the jars, marshals seized several thick notebooks bound in calfskin. Their pages contained diagrams of pelvic bones, sketches of fetal positions, and tables of hereditary traits. These entries, half anatomical study, half perverse manifesto, reveal the full scope of Calderon's intent. One passage reads, "To produce a higher stock, weakness must be ruthlessly excised. The nation cannot advance while shackled to the feeble. Let the womb be an instrument of selection, the knife a tool of culling. Better 10 deaths than one defective survivor." Another table lists proposed matches between daughters and chosen sires, with remarks on temperament, stamina, and cranial symmetry. The language resembles that of livestock breeders, yet here applied without hesitation to human flesh. Public reaction. News of the raid spread swiftly, though officials suppressed the more grotesque details. Still, enough leaked to stir outrage. Broadsheets carried headlines such as Beacon Hill House of Atrocity, and Boston Widow accused of breeding her own. Crowds gathered nightly outside the gates, shouting curses, throwing stones. Children sang mocking rhymes in the streets. Preachers thundered from pulpits about Sodom reborn in New England. And yet among Boston's elite, there remained a current of hesitation. Some whispered that the widow's fall would tarnish families connected to her circle, that exposure might drag down judges, doctors and legislators alike. The society's countermove. Even as investigators prepared charges, the Society for Human Advancement worked feverishly to contain the damage. Letters intercepted that summer revealed discussions of discrediting witnesses, bribing journalists and framing Hughes as an unstable drunkard. One chilling fragment in the hand of a prominent senator states, "Should Calderon fall, she must fall alone. Sever her from us in public, but shield her in private. Remove to Bremen if needed. The cause must not perish with one woman's indiscretion." It became clear that Marguerite Calderon was no isolated fanatic, but a node in a wider lattice of influence. Her destruction threatened to expose men whose reputations and fortunes depended on silent testimony of the servants. Amid this storm, the voices of the lowest household servants emerged, bribed or freed from fear. They gave depositions to the marshals. Their words remain among the most haunting in the record. One maid described, "We were made to wash the sheets after each birth, though often the child was gone by morning. Sometimes we heard cries, but they were muffled quickly. Once I found bones in the ash pile, small as a bird's. I never spoke, for the mistress's gaze was like eye." A stable boy testified, "Gentlemen came at night, paid coin, and were led upstairs. They stayed but a short while. Afterward the young ladies were pale and trembling. When I asked where those gentlemen were from, the mistress said only, 'They serve posterity.'" Such testimonies, though imperfect, painted a picture that no polished manuscript could deny. A household turned breeding ground, its daughters and infants treated as subjects in a grotesque experiment. Nora's end confirmed. Among the evidence was one ledger entry, dated December 1858. Subject, 19, female, mother weakened beyond recovery, terminated both to preserve resources, body consumed in fire. Scholars believe this was the final record of Nora Calderon, the last daughter, erased not by natural death, but by deliberate hand. With this, the line of Calderon women ended, swallowed by the ambition of their mother. Hughes, reading the entry, wrote bitterly, "Her womb was her tomb, and her mother the grave digger." The widow arrested. At last in June 1859, Marguerite Calderon was seized. Accounts describe her as composed, even regal, as marshals led her from the mansion. Witnesses recall her saying, "You may bind my hands, but you cannot bind the future. My work will live on when your petty names are dust." She was confined to the state prison in Charlestown to await trial, yet even there she seemed to exert uncanny influence. Guards reported her receiving letters by unknown hands, speaking with visiting physicians, and drafting long tracts upon scraps of paper. One guard swore he overheard her whisper, "They cannot kill an idea. My daughters are gone, but the seed is already sown elsewhere." The unraveling of the trials. As preparations for trial advanced, cracks appeared, witnesses recanted under pressure, key documents vanished from custody, judges expressed reluctance to admit testimony deemed scandalous. Fletcher raged in private letters, "We have her, we have the evidence, and yet the machine grinds against us. It is as if some greater hand reaches down to protect her, to smother the truth beneath velvet and coin." Hughes, more despondent, confessed in his diary, "I begin to believe justice will never come. This city thrives on silence, and silence it shall have." The widow's defiance. Throughout it all, Marguerite Calderon remained unrepentant. Visitors later recounted her final words to them before sentencing, "You call me monster, but when, in 100 years, the world breeds with science, and culls the unfit by law, they shall call me visionary. My daughters are martyrs, my infants are sacrifices, I am the mother of what is to come." Her words, written down by more than one hearer, echo still in the archive. Toward the collapse, by autumn of 1859, it was clear the trial would be no ordinary matter. On one side, reformers demanded justice, citing ledgers, testimonies, and the bones themselves. On the other, the society maneuvered with wealth and influence to shield itself. The widow's manuscript circulated in secret among intellectuals, some praising her courage, others decrying her as an abomination. Newspapers hinted at scandal without daring to print the full truth, and the people of Boston, walking daily past the blackened ruins of her mansion, shivered with the sense that something vast and poisonous had slipped just beyond reach of law. The stage was set for confrontation, not merely of one woman's crimes but of a society unwilling to face what had been done in its midst. The breeding house of Beacon Hill had fallen, yet its shadow stretched across ocean, for whispers told that ships had sailed from Boston that very year, bearing crates of manuscripts, jars of specimens, and letters addressed to Bremen and Vienna. The experiment, it seemed, was not extinguished. It was scattering seeds cast abroad, awaiting fresh soil.
The year 1860 dawned gray and wind-scoured in Boston, a city strained between reform and denial. Though the Calderon mansion lay in ashes and its mistress behind prison walls, the echoes of her deeds spread outward like ripples in black water. Samuel Hughes described the mood in a letter to Fletcher. "I fear the widow has triumphed, though her hands are bound. She has infected the air itself. Men speak her words in taverns, in lecture halls, in the corridors of the legislature. Her books are read with furtive eagerness. She is more dangerous now than she was in her house." The Charlestown Papers. From her cell, Marguerite Calderon produced a series of papers, copied in a neat, confident hand. Prison guards smuggled them out, whether for coin or for fear of her influence. None could say. The manuscripts circulated among sympathetic physicians and academics, who read them in secret. One passage now preserved in the archives of Massachusetts General declares, "The physician must become farmer of humanity. He must prune, graft, and cull, lest the orchard degenerate into scrub. Compassion is weakness. Posterity demands steel. The mother who destroys her weakling child does not commit murder. She performs the highest act of devotion to the race." Another fragment sketches diagrams of selective pairings, urging legislators to adopt laws of conscription breeding in which worthy males would be matched to healthy maidens under state oversight. Though monstrous, the documents bore the patina of scholarship, citations from Galen, translations from obscure German tracts, calculations in Latin. They were written not in the tone of confession but of prophecy. The trial in ruin. By March 1860, Calderon's trial had become a grotesque spectacle. Crowds gathered at the courthouse, desperate to glimpse the widow, whose veiled figure was escorted each morning by guards. Vendors sold pamphlets and lurid sketches. Street preachers declared her the whore of Babylon. Yet inside, proceedings faltered. Witnesses were absent or hostile. Servants who had spoken freely in depositions now claimed forgetfulness, or contradicted themselves under pressure. Fletcher presented the ledgers and jars, but judges hesitated to admit them, citing decency and the protection of public morals. When Hughes testified describing the specimens he had seen with his own eyes, Defense attorneys attacked his character, implying drink, delusion, and morbid imagination. "This is not medicine but slander," one thundered, while the gallery murmured approval. The trial dragged through spring, until finally in June the court declared that while grave irregularities had been discovered, insufficient evidence tied them directly to the widow. She was convicted only of lesser moral crimes, procurement and concealment, sentenced to 10 years, but eligible for early release. The city reeled, Fletcher raged, Hughes sank into despondency, and Calderon herself, when sentence was read, smiled. The escape records show that Marguerite Calderon did not complete even half her sentence. In November 1862, during the chaos of wartime prisoner exchanges, she vanished. Official documents claim she died of illness within the prison infirmary, her body buried in the pauper's yard, but no death certificate survives, no grave has ever been found. Rumors abounded that she bribed her way free, escaping aboard a merchant vessel bound for Hamburg. Others whispered she donned the garb of a nurse, and walked out during the night, aided by members of the society. Whatever the truth, by early 1863 reports surfaced from Europe. A wealthy widow in Bremen, bearing an uncanny resemblance to Calderon, had established a children's institute, claiming to conduct advanced studies in pedagogy and heredity. The society in retreat. Meanwhile, the Society for Human Advancement fractured under scrutiny. Some members resigned, burning their papers and swearing oaths of ignorance. Others fled as far as Canada or Cuba, taking with them letters, manuscripts, and coin. Yet the core ideals survived. In Massachusetts, new lectures appeared on scientific breeding. Journals published articles on hereditary disease, hinting that the weak might be mercifully prevented from reproducing. Pseudoscience cloaked itself in academic robes, wearing respectability like a mask. Hughes recognized the infection. In one of his most desperate diary entries he wrote, "They say the widow is gone, but she is here in every syllable spoken at these lectures. She has multiplied herself, not in flesh, but in word. I cannot lance this wound. The pus spreads even as I apply the knife." The testimony of Sophia Morton. Among the most tragic voices of the affair was that of Sophia Morton, the mill girl whose infant had been taken. In 1861, she testified before a reform committee, describing how Calderon had promised to find a family for her child. Instead, the infant vanished. Her testimony: "I asked her once, 'Where is my baby?' She said, 'In a place better than your arms could ever provide.' I did not know then what she meant. Now I believe she burned him. I hear his cries in my dreams." The committee dismissed her testimony as hysteria, but pamphleteers seized upon her words, circulating them among abolitionists and reformers as proof of Boston's moral. The Ledger of Bremen. In 1865, a German physician named Dr. Hartmann visited Boston and sought out Hughes. Over supper he revealed that in Bremen he had seen records of a widow houseman who operated a private orphan. Several children died there mysteriously. Their bodies never returned to families. Authorities raided the house, but she escaped before arrest. Hartmann, lowering his voice, asked, "Do you think this houseman could be your Calderon?" Hughes' pale nod. "She has crossed the ocean as easily as a ghost, and like a ghost, she will not rest." Seeds of the future. By the close of the decade it became clear that though Calderon herself might have disappeared into the shadows, her doctrines had taken root. Young physicians debated hereditary purity in lecture halls. Legislators whispered of laws against degenerate breeding. Marguerite Calderon had failed in Boston, failed with her daughters, but she had succeeded in planting a question that society itself would one day attempt to answer: who should live, and who should not? For Hughes and Fletcher, the realization was unbearable. They had sought to expose a crime, but what they uncovered was larger than any household. It was a philosophy, loose in the world, impossible to cage. The widow's final letter. Among the Calderon papers, one scrap remains that may have been penned after her escape. It was sent to Hughes in March 1866, postmarked Hamburg. The handwriting is unmistakable. "Dr. Hughes, you have been a faithful adversary, but you mistake me for a woman. I am not merely flesh. I am idea. You may kill the body, but not the seed. Even now my children multiply, though not of my womb. They are minds, not infants, minds that see the truth as I saw it. When you hear of laws to come, when you read of nations that purge the weak, you will remember me. I am the mother of what is inevitable." Hughes burned the letter, but the words, like ash in his lungs, never left him. By 1870, Samuel Hughes would publish his account, The Beacon Hill Tragedy, to ensure the tale did not vanish into silence. Yet even he admitted, in the book's final lines, "The widow is gone, or perhaps she is everywhere. Which fate is worse I cannot say." By the early 1870s, Boston's elite had tried to bury the memory of the Calderon affair beneath brick and industry. The ruins of the Beacon Hill mansion had long since been cleared. A textile merchant raised a neat Italianate home on the site, its shutters painted in cheerful green. Children played marbles in the street outside, their laughter a deliberate denial of what had once occurred behind those iron gates. And yet the name Calderon clung to the city like smoke to fabric. It surfaced in whispers at dinner tables, in coded references in sermons, in sly comments from European visitors who had heard of Boston's widow. For though Marguerite Calderon had vanished from prison records and fled across the Atlantic, her story had not. Her writings, smuggled and recopied, moved among circles of physicians and lawmakers like contraband scripture. The publication of 1870. In 1870, Samuel Hughes released his book The Beacon Hill Tragedy, a physician's account of pseudoscience and murder, published in Boston at his own expense. The work bore the weight of 2 decades of obsession. He described in spare but cutting prose the cellars, the jars, the ledgers, the bodies of infants consumed in fire. He named Marguerite Calderon plainly, though he altered the names of her daughters to shield surviving kin. The book drew immediate controversy. Reformers hailed it as a necessary exposure of hidden evil. Ministers read passages aloud in churches, denouncing the pride that had turned motherhood into laboratory. But others, especially among Boston's patrician class, attacked it as sensational slander. Newspapers split, some serialized excerpts, others mocked Hughes as a failed physician profiting from tragedy. One review in the Boston Courier sneered, "This Hughes trades in corpses like a ghoul. If his tale were true, let him produce otherwise he spreads only superstition fit for penny novels." And yet beneath the noise, the book found its readers. By 1872, German translations circulated in Leipzig. A French edition appeared in Paris. The widow, it seemed, was gaining immortality in ink. The rise of new theories. What most horrified Hughes was not the dismissal of his work, but its adoption by men he despised. For passages of his book, intended as condemnation, were reprinted in scientific journals as evidence. Scholars in London and Berlin cited Calderon's methods as crude but pioneering efforts at hereditary improvement. Her acts of infanticide were reframed as failed but promising attempts at negative selection. By 1875, lectures in New England medical schools spoke openly of purifying the bloodline. The names were changed, the language softened, but the principles were unmistakably hers. Marguerite Calderon, the Boston widow, had become a ghostly midwife to a new science. Hughes in his journals confessed despair. "I set out to destroy her. Instead I have spread her further. Every word I write against her seems to strengthen her cause. It is as though she uses my pen as her." The children's fate of the Calderon daughters. None survived beyond Nora's death, but there remained the children born of her schemes, the infants that lived past infancy, hidden, spirited away into other households. Records indicate that at least 3 such children were placed with unsuspecting families under false names. One boy, said to be the son of Clara, was raised by a family in Lowell, growing into a banker of some renown. A girl, thought to be Eliza's child, was adopted into a minister's household in Connecticut. Another boy, likely Nora's, was placed with distant cousins near Salem, becoming a teacher. None of these children knew their origin. None bore outward superiority or They lived ordinary lives, raising families of their own. And yet the question lingered. Had Calderon's experiment survived in their blood? Did her hand extend invisibly into the future through them? Hughes never learned the answer. In his book he concluded simply, "They will live as we all do, shaped not by her design but by their choices. That is the mercy." The revelation in Hamburg. In 1876 a letter arrived from Bremen, addressed to Fletcher, who by then had become an aging but respected reformer. The writer, a German doctor, described a scandal a decade earlier. A widow named Hausmann had operated a children's institute, claiming to test advanced methods of breeding and instruction. Several children perished under her care. Authorities raided the house, but the woman fled with a handful of surviving orphans. The doctor concluded, "I believe this Hausmann to be the same as your Calderon." She spoke of Boston often, of her American garden. She said she had been betrayed by small men who could not see great. Thus Calderon's trail stretched confirmed across the Atlantic. She had risen again under another name, continued her work, until discovered, and vanished once more.
The last days of Hughes. Samuel Hughes lived to see the rise of eugenic laws in America. In the 1880s, as states debated the sterilization of defectives, he recognized the widow's words made policy. In one late entry, trembling in his failing hand, he wrote, "I was too narrow. I thought to fight a woman, I should have fought an idea, but who can fight an idea? Once I see her everywhere now, in laws, in lectures, in the faces of young doctors eager to cut. She is not dead. She is multiplying." Hughes died in 1889, aged 64. His funeral was modest, attended by tradesmen and immigrants who respected him. Among Boston's elite, few came. The widow's immortality, and what of Marguerite Calderon? History records no grave, no death. Some say she perished obscurely in Europe. Others claim she returned to America, under yet another name, vanishing into the anonymity of new cities, but fragments suggest otherwise. In 1893, an English traveler in Vienna reported attending a lecture by a veiled woman of commanding presence, who spoke in accented German, of human orchards, and the future harvest of the race. In 1901, a Parisian newspaper mentioned a madame, arrested briefly for running a clandestine maternity home. She vanished before trial, and in 1912, on the eve of global war, a pamphlet circulated in Berlin, quoting words identical to those once penned in the Beacon Hill cellars. Better 10 deaths than one defective survivor. The author anonymous, the source unknown, but the voice was hers. The climax realized by the dawn of the 20th century. Calderon's dream had at last entered reality, not through her daughter's wombs, but through legislation and war. Nations debated sterilization, purity, and selective breeding. What she began in secrecy became policy in daylight. The widow's mansion was gone, her children forgotten, her jars and ledgers locked away, yet her doctrine stood taller than any monument, written now into the statutes of nations. Hughes had once called her the mother who devours her children. History would prove her something worse, the mother who devours generations, and thus the climax is reached, not in a courtroom, not in a fire, but in the realization that Boston's scandal was merely the first birth pang of a much larger horror. Marguerite Calderon had seeded the century, and her harvest was yet to come.
By 1914, Boston had become a city of factories and electric lamps, its old cobblestones darkened by soot, its harbor thick with steamships. The Beacon Hill of Samuel Hughes's day remained, but its mansions were hemmed in by tenements and boarding houses. Most who walked its streets had no memory of the widow's mansion. They knew only rumor, half-remembered stories from grandparents who spoke of that house on Mount Vernon Street with a shudder. But for those who searched in archives, who traced the thin threads of her life across decades, the truth was darker. Marguerite Calderon had not been defeated, only dispersed. The Calderon papers in Berlin. In the autumn of 1912, a trunk of documents was discovered in the cellar of a townhouse in Berlin, abandoned by a French-speaking tenant who had fled suddenly after an anonymous denunciation. The papers, bound in blue ribbon, were addressed in an elegant but forceful hand. Pour mes filles, et pour la société. They contained genealogical charts stretching back generations, diagrams of skulls and hips, measurements of eyes, ears, and posture. There were lists of male donors, their occupations, health and vices noted in obsessive detail. There were instructions for midwives on discarding unsuitable infants without trace, and throughout the pages, a refrain appeared, always in the same steady hand. We are not women, we are orchards. Our wombs are fields. The harvest must be strong. The German police filed the documents under miscellaneous, but a young medical student named Lenz, researching family hygiene, obtained copies. Within 2 years he was lecturing in Munich on racial improvement. He would later advise ministries on sterilization policy. Thus, even in anonymity, the widow's words guided a new generation. They drew charts on blackboards, eerily similar to those once sketched in the Calderon cellar. Some even invoked her name, though never openly. In notes passed privately among physicians, she was the widow of Beacon Hill, a half-mythical progenitor of their science. One doctor, addressing a closed circle in 1915, remarked, "We owe to her the courage to speak aloud what others fear to whisper. She showed us that motherhood may be measured like livestock and improved like wheat." Hughes, were he still alive, would have recognized every phrase. The disappearing heirs, the scattered descendants of Calderon's hidden children, entered the new century unknowing of their legacy. Yet patterns surfaced in census and asylum records, traces too faint to prove, but too sharp to ignore. One Lowell banker, believed to be the grandson of Clara, admitted his youngest child to a sanatorium for nervous fits. Another line in Connecticut ended abruptly when two siblings died of congenital illness before age 20, yet others prospered. The Salem teacher's descendants entered politics, one serving in Congress by 19. Whispers claimed he bore the widow's eyes, the same cold gaze noted in Hughes's journals. His speeches in favor of immigration restriction carried an uncanny echo of her words, "Better to prune than to rot." Whether blood or coincidence, the resemblance was enough to unsettle. Letters from Vienna, in 1916, with war raging across Europe, an American nurse volunteering in Vienna wrote a letter home to her sister in Boston. She described encountering an elderly woman at a convalescent home who spoke fluent English with a Boston accent. The woman, gaunt but commanding, asked the nurse, "Tell me, does Boston still remember me? Do they still speak of the garden I planted?" The nurse, puzzled, asked her name. The woman only smiled. "Once I was Calderon, now I am nothing, yet my children live everywhere." When the nurse returned to the home 2 days later, the woman was gone. No staff recalled her. Her bed was empty. The war as fulfillment. The First World War became, in retrospect, the culmination of all Marguerite Calderon had foretold. Millions of young men, chosen not for weakness but for strength, were slaughtered in fields from Flanders to Galicia. Women wept not for infants lost in shadowed cellars, but for entire generations extinguished in daylight. In 1918, as the war ended, an English officer described a vision during convalescence. "I thought of that Boston widow they whisper of in the war. She killed by dozens. This war killed by millions." Yet both spoke of cleansing, of future strength bought in present blood. She was only an early prophet. Thus the line between private atrocity and public policy blurred until indistinguishable. The true scale, what made Calderon terrifying, was not her survival, nor even her experiments. It was the ease with which the world adopted her reasoning. Where she once commanded a household, now entire governments echoed her doctrine. Where she once culled infants in secrecy, now states decreed sterilizations in daylight. By 1920, laws in the United States mandated such procedures in several states. Germany, too, prepared statutes in the name of racial health. The words had changed. The widow's name was forgotten, but the cadence of her voice lingered beneath every proclamation. One might say she had achieved her dream. She no longer needed to exist. The world itself had become her daughter, carrying her vision forward. Boston's uneasy silence, and yet in Boston, silence remained. The new owners of the Mount Vernon Street house lived without incident. Neighbors avoided the subject. But at night, passers-by sometimes swore they saw a light in the basement windows, though the house had no base. Children whispered of a figure in black at the corner of the street, watching them play. Old women muttered prayers when walking past. In the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Hughes's journals grew brittle with age. Dust settled on the boxes marked Calderon papers, sealed with instructions not to open without permission of the trustees. Few scholars requested them, fewer still were granted access. Yet the story would not die. Each generation rediscovered it, reshaped it, and repeated it. The revelation. By 1922, as nations celebrated modernity, one Boston scholar summarized the truth with weary clarity. The widow was not a woman, she was an idea, clothed for a time in flesh. That flesh rotted, but the idea endured. Wherever men speak of blood and purity, of culling and selection, there she stands in the shadows. She is Boston's gift to the world, and our curse. Thus the revelation. The Calderon affair was never a contained scandal. It was the opening chapter of a global script, written not in one household, but in the veins of the century. And so the story reaches its penultimate act. The world has inherited the widow. Her mansion burned, her daughters dead, her body vanished, but her seed thrived in universities, parliaments, and battlefields. The scale is no longer local, nor familial, it is civilizational. By the 1930s, Boston had remade itself into a modern city, but the shadow of Marguerite Calderon lingered like a stain in its foundations. Few citizens remembered her name, and fewer still spoke it aloud, but her ghost haunted the city's conscience. Every time new laws were proposed to sterilize the poor, or immigration quotas were defended in the language of improving the stock, those who knew the old story felt a chill. The Calderon mansion had long since vanished. In its place stood an ordinary townhouse, indistinguishable from its neighbors, yet the ground beneath carried memory, and mothers walking their children past would sometimes cross themselves without knowing why. The final glimpse. In 1931, a Boston journalist named Thomas Ellery, researching for a series on forgotten scandals of the Commonwealth, discovered references to Calderon's trials in dusty court ledgers. Intrigued, he traced the story through Hughes's private papers, Fletcher's legal drafts, and a scattering of anonymous pamphlets printed in the 1850s. Ellery pieced together enough to write an exposé, but just as he was preparing it for publication, he received an envelope without return address. Inside was a single sheet, written in graceful script. You believe you have uncovered something hidden. You are wrong. I buried nothing. I planted. Do not confuse roots for corpses. What you call scandal is only seed. MC. The ink was fresh. The signature was unmistakable. Shaken, Ellery shelved his article. He told colleagues that some histories were best left to rest. He turned instead to safer subjects. The envelope vanished into a drawer, where it remained when Ellery himself died suddenly. In The Daughter's Legacy, historians have long debated the fates of the Calderon daughters, Clara, Isolde, and Anne. The official record ends with the fire that consumed the mansion, but scattered testimonies suggest a darker resolution. One servant claimed to have seen Isolde's shawl among the ashes, though her body was never identified. Another insisted Clara had been smuggled abroad with her mother. As for Anne, her fate was always murky, yet genealogical traces appear unexpected. Parish records in Hamburg note the baptism of a girl in 1856, born to a widowed American gentlewoman, traveling under the name von Hausmann. The mother vanished from the record the following year, but the child grew to adulthood, later emigrating to Argentina. There she married into a wealthy family, her descendants rising to political influence in the 20th century. Whether she was Calderon's granddaughter or merely coincidence remains uncertain, but in every generation since, rumors surface of a woman with the widow's face, appearing in cities continents apart. Paris, Buenos Aires, New York, always leaving whispers, never proof. The scholars divide. By the mid-20th century, the Calderon affair had entered academic debate. Some dismissed it as Gothic legend, an exaggerated morality tale designed to warn against the dangers of unrestrained science. Others insisted the surviving documents, ledgers, testimonies, letters were too substantial to ignore. The arguments were not merely about the past, but about the present. Eugenics programs were expanding in the United States and Europe. Compulsory sterilization laws were on the books in more than 24 states. In Germany, newly empowered leaders spoke in chillingly familiar terms of cleansing and improvement. To those who remembered Calderon, it was as if her voice spoke through these men. To dismiss her was to blind oneself to the continuity between one widow's experiments and the policies of nations. The collapse of the century, the Second World War, with its camps and laboratories, revealed the full flowering of ideas once whispered in a Beacon Hill cell. When photographs of emaciated children, dissected bodies, and sterilization clinics emerged after 1945, the echoes were unmistakable. Calderon's experiments were no longer unique, but prototypes of something vast and industrial. A Boston physician, who had once studied Hughes's notes, remarked bitterly, "We thought her a monster for sacrificing dozens, yet the world has now sacrificed millions." She was not defeated. She was outpaced. The revelation was unbearable. Many who had studied the widow's story locked their archives, ashamed of how close her language had been to respected medical and political discourse. Her name became taboo again, as if silence could erase complicity. The moral question, yet silence could not dissolve the questions Calderon had forced into the world. How far should science go in pursuit of improvement? What is the value of a human life and who decides it? When the powerful cloak cruelty in the language of progress, how do we resist? These questions did not belong to 1852 or 1945 alone. They recur in every age, dressed in new vocabulary but carrying the same dread. In vitro fertilization, genetic screening, gene editing, each innovation stirs echoes of the widow's vision. Some hail them as miracles, others whisper her name. Samuel Hughes remembered. Against her shadow stands the figure of Dr. Samuel Hughes. He left no family, no dynasty, but his writings survived. His journals, rediscovered in the 1970s, became a cornerstone of medical ethics courses. His insistence that science without compassion is horror remains a guiding principle. At his funeral in 1889, one speaker had declared, "He stood where others knelt, he spoke when others whispered, he chose truth over comfort, and for that he paid dearly." Only later would the world realize how prophetic those words were. The widow's absence. As for Marguerite Calderon herself,
History offers no conclusive end. Some say she died in Europe around 1860, a fugitive in obscurity. Others insist she returned to America, under another name, moving quietly through cities, continuing her work. There are reports, never proven, of a woman resembling her seen in Baltimore in 1872. In each account, she was described as older, thinner, but still possessing that unmistakable authority, eyes that commanded obedience, a voice that mingled seduction with menace. Whether she lived into the new century, or whether her sightings were nothing more than projections of fear, may never be known. Yet perhaps it does not matter. She had already achieved her aim. She had planted her ideas so deeply that they grew without her tending. The last word. In 1974, a historian studying the Calderon papers wrote, "The true horror of the widow of Beacon Hill is not that she lived, but that she lives still, not in flesh, but in policy, in theory, in the ease with which we reduce humanity to diagrams and legend. Every generation must choose whether to follow her, or to follow Hughes. That choice is never finished." And so the story ends, not with resolution, but with a challenge. The mansion is gone, the graves are unmarked, the heirs are ordinary, their blood diluted into the common river of history. Yet the questions remain, pulsing beneath the surface, waiting for the next age to confront them. The past has many secrets, but few are so dangerous as those that disguise cruelty as progress. Marguerite Calderon believed herself a pioneer. Boston knew her as a monster. History remembers her as both. What do you think? Did the widow escape justice? Or was her true punishment to see her vision carried out on a scale beyond her imagining? If you followed this story through every part, thank you for staying with us through the shadows of Boston's history. The past has not finished speaking, and neither have we. There are more hidden scandals, more forgotten crimes, more questions waiting to be asked. Subscribe, stay curious, and we will bring the next dark chapter to light.